Hello and welcome to Thursday's Oireachtas Report. On tonight's programme, Tánaiste Mary Coughlin on that child abuse report into a dark period in our history.
This report poses great issues for the state on how the state discharged its responsibilities. It poses issues for the religious orders, and it poses issues for our wider society.
In the Seanad, Mary White has tough words for the judges who sent children to industrial schools.
And the audacity of the district judges to condemn these little children, or early teens, or whatever they were, to industrial schools. How dare they?
And the cost of food safety comes under scrutiny at the Dáil Public Accounts Committee.
Our guesstimate as to what it will cost the country in terms of personnel and ancillary costs would be 90 to 100 million euros a year.
Tánaiste Mary Coughlin told the Dáil that the Cabinet is to hold a special meeting to consider the Ryan report into child abuse next week. The House will debate the report the following week.
Richard Bruton said the report demanded the attention of the Oireachtas.
Any words of apology, I think, from us on behalf of the state will ring very hollow in the ears of people who went to the courts, were at the mercy of courts and were mistreated by them, who were dependent on the Department of Education to provide supervision and protection for them and were let down, who, when they complained of abuse, were not listened to. It is an appalling litany, and we see a situation where the state, charged with supervision, simply turned its eye the other way. I think we need to not only understand how a system could be worked in this way, how when we entrusted people to care, they were managed in a system, a controlling system, an abusive system that was completely foreign to the notion of care that should be provided to children. I think we need to understand how that happened, why it happened, whether the remnants that caused that to happen.
They need to understand. Hello, you went to college, mister.
How it was that when abusers were known about, they were simply moved on to other institutions and the evidence of the abuse covered up.
Eamon Gilmore said they had to make sure lessons were learned.
The report that has now been made available is shocking in what it tells us about a very shameful period in Irish history. The stories of over 1,000 victims, about how they were sexually abused in many cases, how the sexual abusers were protected, were moved from one institution to another by people who knew what they were doing, the degree of physical abuse that was inflicted on those children who were flogged, who weren't properly clothed, who weren't properly fed. In many cases, circumstances where children were abducted from their families and put into these institutions in a way to provide what can only be described as kind of headage payments for institutions by people who knew that those children were being abused, and the only reason that they were in those institutions was because they were from poor families. It was shameful what took place, and the way in which it was covered up, the way in which people in the then Department of Education knew about it,
and Justice,
didn't do anything about it, colluded in it, and destroyed lives.
Tánaiste Mary Coughlin agreed to a debate after the Cabinet had time to consider it.
I have to say that the report of the Commission of Inquiry into Child Abuse describes one of the darkest chapters in our history. I feel it is appropriate on this occasion to reiterate the words of the then Taoiseach Bertie Ahern of the 11th of May 1999, where he said, on behalf of the state and of all of the citizens of the state, the government wishes to make sincere and long overdue apologies to the victims of childhood abuse for our collective failure to intervene, to detect their pain, to come to their rescue.
Stop repeating
yourselves. The first
yourselves.
recommendation of this report is to confirm, consolidate and enshrine the terms of this apology. This report poses great issues for the state on how the state discharged its responsibilities. It poses issues for the religious orders, and it poses issues for our wider society. I believe that we should carefully reflect on this report. I do agree that we should have a debate in this House, one that is considered and informed, and I would appreciate if perhaps we could come to agreement amongst all of the members of the House on the format of that debate and the timing of it. Our offer is the week after next to allow people to be informed. The government will be having a special meeting to consider this report. However, I do not wish Cloncorla to have any disagreement on the floor of the House. So, in principle, we will agree to the debate, and the timing of that, perhaps we could agree amongst ourselves later.
The Ryan report dominated proceedings in the Seanad today as well. One Fianna Fáil senator said the crimes that children committed, which resulted in them being sent to industrial schools, should be expunged from their records.
There was unity for a time in the Seanad today as members registered their outrage at the abuses outlined in the Ryan report.
But it's not just the churches, though I'm going to come back to that. The issue is like there's the clergy in the churches, there's the state, politicians, judiciary, media. All have questions to answer. All of us have. We provided a huge carpet under which all of this was brushed and swept and hidden. And the reality is that we need to look at the common bonds. And I want to put on the record where I believe a huge element of the problem was. And I know what my phone is going to do after this, but there is the pervasive influence of those secret, shady, sinister, right-wing Catholic organisations who have been in the middle of this all my working life. I can give you chapter and verse. I could name you the people who stood in the way of the Stay Safe programme, who stood in the way of mandatory reporting, who stood in the way of sexual education programmes in schools, and I can go on. And these people did the same here in education, in some of the high offices of state.
I think without question it is the most shameful episode in Irish history. I was listening yesterday to a number of radio stations on the internet that were based in the UK. It was the lead story, and quite rightly so. It was the same on Sky News. And to hear the harrowing accounts of people who suffered abuse at the hands of these evil monsters. For example, one particular victim said last night, who was the centre of the documentary Dear Daughter back in 1996, that she spent from the age of 3 weeks to 17 years and 10 months being terrorised and brutalised in an institution. It was absolutely appalling, it is sickening, and it is disgusting. And to hear Senator O'Toole's passionate contribution about the right-wingers, the extreme headbangers who stood in the way and provided obstacle after obstacle when people tried to get truth, and when the victims of this horrid and evil abuse tried to get some sort of closure on the issue, it is absolutely appalling.
Independent Senator Owen Harris then raised the connection with the abuses with nationalism.
And I have no doubt that every brother and priest involved was a devout nationalist. Indeed, that was part and parcel of the thing. But it was the relationship with the Republic and the Republic's professional classes and the Republican ethic that concerns me. Because it took ministers for education, politicians, barristers, lawyers, doctors, the entire Irish professional middle class, which all professed republicanism and all wanted a united Ireland. It was that class which turned a blind eye. However, it's ironic, isn't it, that we didn't have, if we had never left the British Empire, if the treaty had never been signed, that whatever else we might have suffered, these innocent victims wouldn't have suffered.
There were criticisms too for the court judges who sent children to the industrial schools.
And I would like to take the opportunity this morning to call for the crimes that these young people were supposed to have committed, like stealing a bar of chocolate, and that these district judges from a superior class in society in those years, I don't think we have we had a much more defined class structure during these years when this happened. And the audacity of the district judges to condemn these little children, or early teens, or whatever they were, to industrial schools. How dare they? And I am immediately calling for their crimes to be expunged. Just think about it, Cathaoirleach. The people who committed these crimes are not being exposed, will not pay for these crimes. And the children who were guilty of these minor crimes, who came from poor families, I'm sure 99% of the time, have still got on their records that these puny crimes are on their records. I'm calling for these crimes to be expunged from the records of these poor people, these poor children.
The Public Accounts Committee was told